Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me participate in this hearing, although as a member of the full committee, I'm not a member of this subcommittee. And I want to commend you for being the author of the Global Anti-Semitism Review Act of 2004 that established the Special Envoy on global anti-Semitism.
If the gentleman would yield, I was the House sponsor, Voinovich was the Senate sponsor, but when his bill came over, which called for a one-year review, I offered the amendment to make it a permanent office and then also to establish the special envoy that Ira so faithfully led for several years.
Yes, and I also have a personal connection to that office since my wife was the first deputy special envoy, and I take family pride in her work on the report on global anti-Semitism issued by the State Department in March of 2008. And my first question for our panel is, we did write that report. It's almost 10 years ago. Do we, I'm not saying we can write one every year, but should we be writing one every decade? Do we need another report on contemporary global anti-Semitism? Yes, Ms. Bird.
It's always a good idea to highlight issues and do special reports. If you look at the annual country reports on human rights and international religious freedom, you will see that Ira Foreman and the team that is still working every day in the State Department do not get much sleep before those reports are due. And what you have done to require these good public servants to ask every single embassy in the world to report on anti-Semitism, when you pull that together, it is a terrific snapshot. Your legislation was game-changing, and we have eyes on the problem in places we never did. Every 10 years, it would be very, very wise to do a similar kind of report. And I know Mrs. Sherman's expertise was absolutely essential to that successful report, and you're wise to be very proud of her.
Thank you. One thing that report does is it defines anti-Semitism, basing its definition in large part on the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia's working definition of anti-Semitism. And defining anti-Semitism is important, especially in dealing with what I'd have to describe as far left-wing or misguided left-wing anti-Semitism. On the extreme right, you see references to Nazis. It's pretty obvious that it's anti-Semitic. But you also see attacks on the Jewish people where the attack, where the attacker defends and says, "Oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, just anti-Zionist." And there needs to be a definition that distinguishes between legitimate criticism of the government of Israel, something most members of this panel have engaged in from time to time, and a holding Israel up to a standard that no other country is held to, or claiming that of all the countries in the world and all that this is the one country that should be abolished. What I wonder, though, is that the U.S. Department of Education doesn't have a definition of anti-Semitism, has not yet adopted the State Department definition. Does it undermine us in talking to other countries about anti-Semitism in their country that we are defining anti-Semitism by a standard that we don't apply here domestically? Rabbi?
I think it's a quite pertinent question, and I would sort of turn around and say our ability to be a strong advocate in pressing governments, as we are, to employ the working definition whether it's in police training, whether it's in training judges and prosecutors, whether it's in monitoring anti-Semitism, would certainly be enhanced if we can cite our own example in the United States of putting it to use. I think we all would hold the view, I know my organization does, when this issue first came up in the last Congress, that this working definition is a very useful educational tool. If it's a useful educational tool for the Justice Ministry of Austria, I'd say it's a useful educational tool for the Department of Education here, which is concerned about monitoring and addressing problems of anti-Semitism on college campuses. And if I could also speak to your first question, a U.S. global report about anti-Semitism, even if it has the same information, and by the way, it's increasingly having much more, I think, we know what's gathered, but even if it has the same information as our own Jewish organizations might report, has an impact that's unparalleled in getting government's attention. So having that report really allows us and everyone else to go in and to push these governments who are now taking notice. And finally, it has also educated, let's be candid, our own American diplomats. As embassies have a responsibility to monitor what's going on, they're becoming more sensitive to what this is about. And again, in these places, that definition is a very helpful tool.
It's been my experience in Congress that one of the best ways to affect what people do is to ask them the right question. And by asking all of our embassies on a continuing basis to ask their host governments, what are they doing about anti-Semitism, you drive policy in the right direction. Mr. Weitzman.
So I would just like to add as well that, as you know, the 31 member nations of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance officially adopted the variation of the working definition of anti-Semitism. And in the negotiations and conversations with the countries leading up to that, its adoption, and my colleague, Dr. Robert Williams from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, was instrumental in assisting in this process as well. We found very often the question raised of what is the United States' position on this. We were able to refer to the State Department website and the document on the website, but that obviously only dealt with external and multilateral relationships. It didn't deal with the domestic case at all. So having this definition through the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that is now being held up in Congress, we think would be very powerful and very strong and send a message not only to domestic constituents in the United States in terms of the people on campus, even clarifying it for the administrators. It's a tool for the administrators and the people dealing with this issue on campus, as well as for the protection of students. But it also sends a message externally as well to other countries that we are basically putting into practice what we are preaching. That our moral voice and political leadership is strong on this issue, and we feel it applies as well to the United States.
And I think it undercuts our foreign policy across the board when people can point to an example where we have a standard to hold other countries to, and we refuse to oppose that standard on ourselves. The Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would be, I strongly support it, but frankly, it shouldn't take that. The Department of Education has a responsibility to enforce Title VI. I've worked with that department over the last 10 years, and we got a clear statement that Title VI applies to anti-Semitism, although the statute says national origin and race, that clearly applies to the Jewish people as well, and to bigotry against Muslims as well. And it is, if the Department of Education has determined that it has a responsibility to deal with anti-Semitism on campuses, it has a responsibility to have a definition of anti-Semitism. And one would wonder why they wouldn't adopt the same definition that has been adopted by so many organizations, with a tweak here, with a tweak there, and especially why they wouldn't adopt the same definition of anti-Semitism that the State Department uses for our foreign policy. I want to shift to Hungary. I'd like to know more about this, and I'm going to mispronounce it, Vitesse Rend. It's my understanding that there are two rival organizations using the same name. Is there any doubt that this organization is an anti-Semitic organization? I'll ask this to Rabbi Baker, and then see if anyone else has a comment.
You know, this is an organization sort of reconstituted from a pre-war organization that was certainly anti-Semitic, fascist, part of the supporters, followers of Admiral Horthy, and
a pro-Nazi organization during World War II.
exactly that. So I don't know that it has much influence today in Hungary, but the reality is this is its origin, and it was around this sentiment, these ideological views, clearly anti-Semitic, that it was reformed. So I guess a clear answer would be
I mean,
yes.
if somebody formed an organization called the Nazi Party of California, they may not publish a manifesto that is anti-Semitic. They don't need to. They name themselves the Nazi Party of California, and they have associated themselves with the Nazi Party of Germany and the role it played in world history. So we don't have to wait for today's Vitesse Rend to publish a anti-Semitic manifesto. They've named themselves after or claim to be a continuation of an organization that was the pro-Nazi organization in Hungary in the 30s and 40s.
I think they knew what they were doing when they chose their name. So, you know.
Yeah. Now I'm going to get down in the weeds on this, and this may not be. I'm told that members of this organization add a V as an additional middle initial to show their support for the organization. Are you aware of that practice?
I am not, but maybe others.
Gotcha. Want to thank you for your work. Thank the chairman for holding these hearings, and yield back.
Thank you. Just a few follow